If you're watching this video, chances are you're wondering how you change your spark plugs on your Toyota 4Runner, whether it be because it's your recommended 30,000 mile interval, or you just want to change them for some other reasons. And lucky for you, I'll be showing you exactly how to do just that, and I'll walk you through all the steps. Now, I will be using a 2004 Toyota 4Runner Limited V6 with a 1GR-FE engine. However, this video should be the same, or at least the process should be exactly the same for 2003 to 2009 Toyota 4Runners, aka the 4th gen. And let's begin. So before we start, I'd just like to go over the tools we'll be using. Now, of course, you're going to need your spark plugs. Since I have a V6, I'll be needing 6 of these spark plugs. Toyota recommends you go with the Denso or NGK brands. Stick with the OEM equivalents. And so this specific model number for the Denso is SK204R11, and the equivalent NGK is ILFR6T11. Whichever brand you go with is up to you. Toyota uses both of them. I just went with this one because that's what I prefer, and it was slightly cheaper. Toyota does recommend that you go with Iridium spark plugs. The service manual does say specifically for Iridium, and there are different types of spark plugs. You could go for copper, lasts roughly 20 to 30,000. Platinum or double platinum, 60 to 100,000, and Iridium, which is the longest, the most expensive, but should last you the longest, could go up to 100,000 miles, but how you drive and many other factors will dictate how long that spark plug actually lasts. However, these Iridium ones are, like I said, are the ones that Toyota recommends, and they are the most expensive. But considering not changing them that often, I think it's worth it. Other than spark plugs, you're gonna need a wrench, some extensions, torque wrench. If you don't have a torque wrench, I'll show you how to do it without it. You need some sockets, 10 and 12 millimeter, and a specific socket for spark plugs. This is a 5/8 spark plug socket. It has a rubber insert in the middle to protect this and to keep it in place when you remove it and put it back in. And it may not hurt to have one of these wobble socket adapters for the driver's side ones, and a spark plug gap tool, just in case these do not come pre-gapped. These did, and the gap from the electrode to the top, the ground electrode part, should be 0.043 inches, and they did come gapped, which was very helpful. Also, you should get some silicone or dielectric grease, technically speaking, which this is, and some compressed air, whether it be in a can like that or from a tank such as that. Alright, so the first step is to, of course, open the hood, but other than that, we're going to remove these 2 engine cover bolts. These are 10 millimeter. Then you're just going to lift this off, and it's secured on the back. If you look at that, rotates on that the back rod part. Then you could just set this to the side. Next up, you're going to remove the air filter box, which is this. So it's just these little spring clamps here, and then rotates on the back, fits in a slot like that, but just take it out. This is a good time to change your air filter, at least inspect it. This is the air filter right here. Goes in one way, one orientation. And if you are going to put a new one in there, just please take off the plastic. But that's a new one, so we could just put that off to the side. Alright. Next up, if you have a brush, just give a little brush to the bolts, get some loose flakes of rust off. If you don't, not a problem. So now we have to remove these electrical connectors, although I'm only going to be doing one at a time. And don't pull by the wires, pull by the actual tab. Doesn't come off. You may have to give a little help pry it off. Just like that, and inspect it to make sure there's no funny colors. You don't want any rainbow colors in there, just nice metal is good. Put that to the side. And then we're ready to take off this. All right, so now we're gonna remove this 10mm bolt holding the ignition coil in place. I'll be using a 10mm bolt, as I said, to take it off. However, if it's either too rusted where it can't, the normal socket doesn't grip on, or it's just not working for you, you may have to get one of these bolt extractors. Basically, they have spiraled flutes in them, and they're reversed, so that way as you put it on and you loosen it, it bites into the bolt. And if that's the case, you're gonna want to get a new bolt. Just go to the local parts store or hardware store and get a new bolt. If you have the luxury of using these, they work really well, but it's just better off you don't use them. That way you don't have to replace new stuff, but if you do, not a big deal. So we're just gonna put that on here. And if you are able to loosen it a little bit, and if it's getting tighter as you loosen it, as counterintuitive as that may sound, you may be close to stripping off the head, in which case you loosen it, tighten it, loosen it, back and forth. That's the case. Let's not forget the washer that stays on there. As you can see, this is the bolt. Put that to the side. And then this thing should just come right off. Just like that. Perfect. And you got the ignition coil right here. If you're replacing this, good time to do it now. If not, put it to the side. Next, you want to get some compressed air and spray it in here, because once you remove the spark plug in there, if you don't, dirt will go into the engine and you will not be happy. So just spray a little bit in there. Now I have my specific 5/8 of an inch spark plug socket on here. Gonna get that seated in nicely. Okay, then break it loose. And then should be able to just untwist it by hand. And again, the whole point of having that specific spark plug socket, so that way when you're lifting it up, the spark plug doesn't just fall right out of that socket, it stays in place. There we go. As far as spark plugs go, to the best of my understanding, that's not bad. As you can see, the top electrode doesn't have a dip into it. It looks pretty decent. The main electrode also doesn't have any grooves or whatnot. It looks pretty healthy to me on this aspect, although I have to check the gap, but regardless, I'm still going to replace it. And if you do manage to take out one spark plug and it looks iffy or not good, replace them all, period. And if you could see, this is actually a Denso as well. The other side may be NGK, but we'll find out soon enough. So you definitely want to compare them to make sure that they're the same. Before you replace any part, you should do that. Yeah, this does not appear to be Iridium, but I can't tell just by looking at it. Could just be the design. S Denso K20HR-U11. That's the one that was in there. And this looks pretty good. There's no rust on the old one on this part of the electrode. So before you put the new spark plug in, you want to check the gap using one of these tools. They're pretty cheap, they're only a few dollars on Amazon, a few different ones, but these are the ones I have. This one, not advised to use if you're using Iridium or Platinum spark plugs, in which case I'm using Iridium, so I would use this one. Just because when you put it on here and you slide it, you're scraping against the electrode, so it's not recommended to do. And again, for this car, this spark plug, the gap should be 0.043. So I'm going to find 0.04. That fits in pretty nicely. 0.045 does not, so that's between that, so that's good. And if it's too much, you're just going to use the tool and either bend it back slowly or get a hard surface and push it inwards if it's too big of a gap. But these all came pre-gapped and I checked them and they're good, so I don't have to do any of that. Alright, so next we're going to be installing the new spark plug socket. Now, I contacted Denso and asked if they recommended anti-seize on these threads. They said no. NGK also does not recommend that. But a good rule of thumb is that for spark plugs, if this part that threads into the engine is shiny, no anti-seize. If it's not shiny, then what you do is up to you. But I contacted them and they said not to put it on there. So I'm going to be putting spark plug socket in here, and this is why you get that specific socket for the spark plugs, because it doesn't come out. So hand thread this in first. So if you don't hand thread it, you may ruin those threads, and that is not a good day for you. And it should be pretty easy to do. If you get resistance, then reverse it and put it back in, because you're probably cross-threading it. At that point, you should just take it out and redo it. Alright, so that's as high as I can go. Put my ratchet on there. Okay. So, if you have a torque wrench, you'll torque it to 180 inch-pounds, aka 12 foot-pounds. But if you don't have a torque wrench, once this becomes hand tight, do it about a 1/16 of a turn tighter, and then you should be good. But I do have a torque wrench, and I will be using that. So I have mine set to 180 inch-pounds. That's it. 180 inch-pounds and you're good to go. Alright, so next up, before you put the ignition coil back on, it is recommended you put some dielectric grease in here and over here. Some people use a Q-tip. I'm just not a fan of that, just because the fibers on Q-tips may get caught in there and reduce the contact, but I don't know how much of that will actually happen. So I have some 3M silicone paste dielectric grease. You don't need too much, just some in there. You could also put it on the spark plug, the white part itself, the ceramic part first, but then it gets in the socket and you don't feel like doing that. That should be good. Alright, so next we have the coil and we're going to put it in. And it should get seated nicely on the spark plug. There we go. Alright, so next we're just going to be putting the 10mm bolt back on. If you want to get a new one, more to you. If not, because, I mean, this one's rusted on the top, but it's not bad. Still usable. I'm just going to keep it on there. Hand tight it first, always. There's no torque spec for this. It's just to make it hand tight or wrench tight. No 200-pound gorilla needed on this. Okay, and then connector. Make sure it's in the right orientation. Do the little tug, not on the wires, but on the plastic part. And that's it. That's one spark plug. And from here on out, it's just each other spark plug one at a time, and then you're done. Soon enough, you'll see me snap the head off this bolt. I tried using pliers, bolt extractors, rust penetrant. I didn't want to use heat or drill it out because I just wasn't comfortable with that. And I couldn't get a nut welded on there due to the limited space, even though the threads were sticking up. So what happened was I wound up replacing the spark plug and everything was basically good. It's just when I put the ignition coil back on, I used a high heat epoxy to put in that little hole where that bolt would go. So now that ignition coil is kind of glued into place. So hopefully I don't have to ever change it again due to the life of the plug and how much longer I expect to have the car. But if I do, it's just going to be a matter of prying the ignition coil off and just replacing it. Not a big deal. I just wasn't careful when I was trying to remove that bolt. I think I got a little lazy and thought it was coming out, but turns out it got really tight and I just pulled a little bit more and it snapped it off. So just be careful. So the audio I'm covering up is basically me talking about how you don't have to remove the bracket or any of the hoses to access any of the bolts or the ignition cores or the spark plugs. Well, it turns out I was wrong. The bracket that I was pointing to, the two 12mm bolts, the top one has to come off, the bottom one can just be loose, and you can move the bracket left and right just to get it out of your way depending on which spark plug you're working on. And then there's a hose directly behind it, just held in by two hose clamps. Just get a pair of pliers and it should come right off. And those are the only two things that you have to move. Everything else you could just push to the side. You don't have to take anything else off. It's really simple, not a big deal. But definitely recommend to have some type of wobble adapter. and some extensions. This is the part where you're going to want to have those on hand. It makes it much easier to do. It looks like that's coming off. Well, I'm not going to remove the bottom one, I'm just going to loosen it. Top one's coming out though. It's this thing right here. Slide that to the side, back and forth, however you need to move it. Yeah, that's better. Oh, okay. Just pulling on it wrong. So that hose came out. Not forget the orientation of that. This one comes out. So for that, I'm just putting my thumb on the tab, I'm pushing down the tab, and I'm using the wider end flathead screwdriver to basically just push it out. Like the clips in like this, I'm using the screwdriver to push on this way while I push down the tab, and that works. It's annoying, need some patience. Overkill? Maybe, but this looks like it'll work the best without taking off this stuff. That one's on, that one's on, that one's on, very good. Now to put this stuff back on. And then after those hoses are on, just this 12 millimeter bolt, both on the top and the bottom, although the bottom I didn't take it off, I just loosened it. Very good. Just make sure nothing else. I'm going to take anything else off. God. Alright, so last up, once everything's good to go, all the connections are on. These two clips are going to go into these slots over here at an angle. And then put these on. That's it for that. And then just give a tug on this side to make sure it's actually in there, it's not just sticking out. Once you have that, then take the cover. These two parts go on, rotate on these things. That's that. And then your 10 millimeter nuts. And these, no torque spec, don't even make them super tight, just barely tight enough, barely hand tight, otherwise you'll strip them right out. And that's it. That's all there is to changing your spark plugs. Although, last thing you should do is turn the engine on and let it run for a few minutes, even take it for a drive just to make sure it sounds right, works right. But also, don't expect your car to perform like a Lamborghini. You're changing the spark plugs, and if it really makes that much of a difference, your spark plugs are way overdue. And if it doesn't, well, at least you don't have to worry about the spark plugs needing replacing anytime soon. It's one more thing to check off the maintenance list. So that's all I have for you now. Don't forget though, the description may contain helpful links, directions, and information, so maybe check that out. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and if you have any questions or comments, well, you know what to do.